family from Dartmouth that had a significant footprint in the early days, but later on sort of disappeared from the records at least. But I'm going to use a slightly different approach than I normally use. I have very few slides, but I have detailed printouts. Some are from original records. I'm very happy to say that I'm using collections of primary records that are what most historians prefer to use. And among these are the Dartmouth Town Meeting records that are handwritten. We have copies, scanned copies of the handwritten town meeting records of Dartmouth. And that's a primary record set that's not available really anywhere else at this point. We're also using the Quaker minutes because they're certainly something that we've labored long and hard to get up on our website and to begin transcribing. And those are primary data sources for getting any historical information. And thirdly, one of our board members has done some very interesting research in the land records and using the family search databases that are available, have all the Bristol County land records, so you can read if you can read the handwriting, you can read the records. And Marion has not only read the handwriting, but she's transcribed the handwriting, having to do with one of the Merrithews brothers that came to Dartmouth. So I'm going to be handing these out, and in most cases I have several copies of various and sundry detailed extracts from the records. And while I'm talking, these can be circulating, and these are, I don't have enough copies to give to everybody, but there's 3 to start around, and that has to do with selected references in the old Dartmouth Town Meeting records for the Merrithews name. And among other things, you'll give you an example of how many different spelling varieties there were. And the ones I have up there and the ones that are here are just a small fraction of how many variations in spelling the records have of this particular family. And these, to kind of give you a little walkthrough of what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about what we think we know about the origin of the name. Most of that is speculation, but interesting speculation. We're going to talk about the family before it got to Dartmouth, what we know about it. And then in early Dartmouth, starting with early Dartmouth, we have pretty good primary documentation of why we say what we say. And then one particular of the brothers that came to Dartmouth, named Josiah, was really a notable guy. I mean, he was a significant operator in New Bedford, in Dartmouth. And I'll tell you why and some of the things that we know about him. And a little bit about the name variations. And you'll understand when we talk about the origin of the name, why there perhaps are so many variations. And then we'll talk about the fact that the name, you don't see the name very much anymore, or if at all, in Dartmouth. But we'll talk about that and perhaps why to some extent. Okay, and then we'll talk about a connection. Well, this is kind of an interesting derivation of the family descendant of this guy Josiah, this guy. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, the name. Most of what I learned about the name I'm borrowing, and lots of people have studied the family. And as you all know, if you know how to use the internet, you can find an awful lot of things, some of which are true, some of which are not true, and some which you don't know whether they're true or untrue. And so you use your best judgment and see what makes a little bit of common sense. Several researchers assert that the family came from Ireland, or at some time in their prior history before they came here. they're Irish. And the reason for that is that the first name that connects with this family that showed up in Yarmouth, Massachusetts. And he's in the records, and his name was Teague, T-E-A-G-U-E by some spellings, T-E-E-G by others, T-E-A-G by others, and then his last name was sometimes recorded as Amaraho. And again, you'll see as we go along why that was. Not everyone believes he came from Ireland itself, but they think he was an Ulster Scotsman who lived in Scotland, but he left Ireland to go to Scotland. And they spoke Irish, of course, early. If you go back early enough and you came from the right place, you spoke Gaelic. And the Gaelic word, they go into great detail, some of them, and explain what the word looked like. And I think I have it later on, but we'll get to that later. And the last part of the word is the same part of a Gaelic word that is in Donahue or in Murphy and others' name. Quite often the word is the same Gaelic name is translated into Murphy or Murrow or one of those M names that's Irish. Other times the end of the name, the Donahue name, Donahue Irish name, the Hugh part of it is the same ending as in the name that it becomes Merrithews. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, these are some of the more common variants right here. The Merrithews with 2 R's and the Merrithews with a T near the end sort of followed 2 of the brothers that came to Dartmouth. One of the brothers was Jonathan, and the other brother was Josiah. There was another brother, Samuel, who owned land off Fisher Road that Marion researched. And he left offspring. He was married to a Kirby, and more of the descendants of the women without the Merrithews last name are still around Dartmouth. But this is what I was just saying here. Jonathan tended to be, and some of Jonathan's descendants left town and went north and ended up in Nova Scotia. And one of his sons, named Roger Merrithews, he owned a tavern on Noshawn Island, where all the boats stopped, the stopping place. I forget the name of it. Some of you might remember it, but that Roger left lots of descendants from up in the north. The next slide, please, Donald. Okay, some of this gets to be, this is the Irish name, and then they go on to say this, the ending, see, Chada, and I don't speak Gaelic, and if any of you do, correct me, but they say that if you pronounce this in Gaelic, it sounds like Hugh or Ho. And that's why Ho is frequently part of the spelling of Maraho in a lot of the records.
How you run that is you or who mean anything like Kingston really means Kingstown.
It may, but I don't know it. I'm always looking for new research topics. That'd be a great topic to find out about. But that same ending is an ending that's used with Donahue. So you see the H-U-E, H-E-W, H-O-E. They're all, some people pronounce Donahoe, and some pronounce Donahue. So this is the, and they're saying that very often this Gaelic term was anglicized as Murphy, Morrow, Murrow. They say Merrithews is actually a closer phonetically to the correct Gaelic pronunciation of the name. So I just posed that, could some of the world's Murphys have been Merrithews? Maybe. I thought I'd get a horde of Irishmen here today, but I don't get any.
They're called Merrithews.
Yeah, I should have called the Murphy clan line. Okay. Next slide, please, Don. Okay, let's get back to how they got here and so on. As far as some of the other researchers believe, and they assert, but they don't give a lot of evidence from a historian's or genealogist's point of view, they just assert that the father of the bunch that came to Dartmouth, Teague, again spelled, I mean the last name and the first name both really all kinds of spellings. And they came to Yarmouth in the mid-1600s, and the speculation is that they were slaves, or they were being kicked out of wherever they were. Most likely, most likely. But they weren't very welcome in colonial Plymouth colony because they're Irish. And I mean, and they had been an uprising in Great Britain of the Irish were really anti-English, as everybody knows. So that's some of the speculation about how come he got there. He is documented as paying taxes in Yarmouth. And my speculation is that one of the reasons they ended up in Dartmouth was that the Quakers of Sandwich and Cape Cod were probably attracted and probably tolerated these Irishmen who were there, who other people didn't. And they said, gee, why don't you come with us Giffords? We're going to Dartmouth. And it's out there on the frontier of the colony, and nobody bothers us out there. And that's my speculation how they ended up in Dartmouth, because they were Quakers pretty early on, and I suspect that's how they got here. He had 8 children. We don't know his wife's name. He had 4 sons and 4 daughters. His sons were John, Samuel, Josiah, and Jonathan. And we have records for Samuel, Josiah, and Jonathan in Dartmouth. We may have some for John. I'm not sure yet. I haven't looked at all the records that we have in the town meeting records yet, or in the Quaker meeting records. And I'm sure if we look in the land records, we may find John at the right time to possibly be this. But with all the different spellings, looking in the index to find them is not so simple, because you got too many places to look. Anyway, the daughters were Mary, Sarah, Mercy, and Experience, and that's how they spelled Experience. These 3 were in Dartmouth, and they're in the town meeting records. And next slide. No. In the Dartmouth town meeting records and in other places, we find that Josiah, in 1695, married Hope Fish, and apparently the marriage took place in Portsmouth. So she is from Portsmouth. And later on, you'll see that some relative of hers, I think it's her father, sold at least 100 acres of land to Josiah, and Josiah would have been his son-in-law, or a relative of his wife's. And in 1703, this is when that purchase took place. And that's 100 acres in Smith Mills, by the way. And it includes the land where the Bank of America is located, and the Quaker burial ground near the Bank of America, and 100 acres, including the junction where the road, Faunce Corner Road and Hicksville Road, split. And his house was on the spot at the split, where the split is, before there was a split, because Hicksville Road is more recent than Faunce Corner Road.
That cemetery, is that the same one next to Bank 5 on Faunce Corner Road?
No.
So
No, that's a different cemetery.
That cemetery you're talking
It's behind
from the
Five
road?
Guys.
Yeah, it's right on the old.
You can't see it from the road.
No. But you can if you're on old Faunce Corner Road, which goes around the back.
Yeah.
It's right on that road.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Behind Five Guys.
Yeah, it's a very good-sized cemetery. It goes up on a hill. It's right in back of.
How many people would you say are buried there?
We have a count, and the report that Judy Lund has in her book has a count and the names that are on the, and that book, by the way, is on our website. So it's a lot of Giffords in here, as we all know. But George Almy, who owned the old house on Old Westport Road, is also in there. And he lived in a house that was formerly Josiah Merrithews' house at the point. That house is gone. They built another house there. But that's kind of an interesting thing. If you think about Smith Mills, where Lowe's is and all that stuff, that was probably all this guy's land. So he's kind of a big-time operator for those years. In the Dartmouth Town Meeting records, we also have Samuel, who was the landowner that Marion researched. He was a petty juryman, as Josiah was a petty juryman. Okay, next, and you can look, the handouts show the actual record, the handwritten record. That's a transcription. That's a handwritten transcription of the original. It's not the original, but it's a handwritten transcription. Kathy?
What is a petty juryman?
What is a petty? You don't try big, serious trials. It's in the lower courts.
Oh, okay.
It's a jury of 12 as opposed to a grand jury.
Okay. As a lawyer, I should have called on you. That's good, good. I never really knew. I was just winging it. When you don't know, say what you do know. But admit it. Next slide, please. Now, this is Henry Worth's map. And Donald pointed out a very important thing. Some of this map, mostly the land ownerships and roughly the boundaries, is probably reasonably accurate because Henry Worth was into the land records, if nothing else. He was a lawyer. He closed deals with, and so forth. The roads, we know this road did not go beyond that point until after 1900 or just before 1900. And all of this road was probably not...
I don't think this road here came through either.
Yeah, this is supposed... This is what...
Hathaway Road.
This is Hathaway Road right here.
And Slocum.
And this is Slocum Road here. Donald's pointing there and I'm pointing here.
Yeah.
This is Tucker. That's Tucker Road.
That's Chase.
Yep. And that's Chase. That's Old Westport Road and Chase Road.
Here's Old Westport Road.
And this is the old Cummings house, the yellow house on the corner.
So all of this Route 6, all the way to New Bedford, was not there.
This is the so-called point between Old Fons Corner Road. The cemetery is right in here, right there. This is where the meeting house was. And that's probably the dimensions. In some of the stuff that we'll get to later, the meeting house was, I think it said 30 by 30. So that's probably the meeting house right there. And the 100 acres kind of spread around, right in here, down here. And I'm not... Hart was another big landowner in Smith Mills. Maxfield, likewise, it is. But this is what, people had large amounts of land in those early days. If you have, this is in one of the old Dartmouth Whaling Museum sketches, sketch 20, I believe. And it's a history of Smith Mills, and it's terrific. He really gives you a lot of good information, and he was a very reliable source for Dartmouth history. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry?
You're talking about Henry Worth.
Yes, yes. Okay, now we get to a little bit more detail. And these are extracts from the Dartmouth monthly meetings, men's minutes, regarding Josiah Merrithews. I picked out not everything that's there, but some that kind of illustrate how important he was to the monthly meeting, Dartmouth monthly meeting, and some of the events in his life. In 1745, the monthly meeting approved a local meeting in Smith Mills, and it was going to be meeting at Josiah Merrithews' house. Notice the date, 1745. 1748, they approved continuing this at either Josiah Merrithews or Adam Mott. Adam Mott was another resident of Smith Mills. And this is 3 years later, so that apparently meant that they were doing it for those 3 years. Sometimes I think among Quakers called a worship group or a preparative meeting. I'm not sure what it would be called at this point because they don't mention it in the records. Then again, about a year later, they said, keep going for 6 more months. So they kept a little rein on them, but they said, you can keep going for 6 more months. Then in 1751, this is quite a while from 1745, 6 years later, keep it going as heretofore at Josiah Merrithews or thereabouts, any house in that location, because they didn't want to have to walk. Remember, people didn't jump in the car and drive to a Pontiac meeting. They got on a wagon or walked, and a long way from Smith Mills down to Pontiac meeting house. So they said, well, it's okay, have a little meeting up there. Then in 54, again, that's 9 years from the beginning. This is in a minute. Friends think it's necessary that we build a meeting house. We've been meeting there for 6 or 7 years. Let's build a meeting house near Josiah Merrithews. So they formed a committee. This is the old writing. When we transcribe these records, we try to transcribe them exactly as they are. So it's a committee. The ... means I left out a few. Sometimes there's more words than you want. They named the committee, and they wanted the committee, this is the lingo that they use, to have a right understanding of said matter. This a frequent use of the word said. We already said that. Let's not waste a lot of ink. Just say of said matter. And if they think it's proper to have a meeting house, to continue about the place and the dimensions of the house. The Y-E is really the, okay? So in other words, this committee is if you think it's right to do, where you got to put it? And how big should it be? That's really what they're asking. Then on the 5th, again the same year, now they're getting serious. They're going to talk about a meeting. They added some more people to the committee. They wanted to put maybe some carpenters or whatever. I don't know what they were. Next slide, Don. We're gonna have. There's a lot of information in these monthly meetings, records, the minutes. So here we are, still in 54. They approved of a place at Newtown near to Merrithews and bounded. They said they took out the lot. They measured out the lot in his land, because he gave them about an acre for the meeting house and the burial ground. And Merrithews doth promise that he will give it to the Friends. And he did. He did. Then a little later on, they got another committee to get the deed to the land and to build the meeting house, for building the meeting house near Josiah Merrithews. Then in another same year, they subscribed money to fund the meeting at Newtown. And the first subscription, they got a 401 pound, 10 shillings, old tenor. And there's another study in itself about what money and all that stuff for the said house. Well, it'll cost about 1,000 pounds in Rhode Island currency. The house is to be 30 foot square and 9 foot, I imagine, high. But we couldn't read the handwritten thing, so this is the standard use in a transcription. If you can't read it, put a question mark in it. And then again, they appointed a couple of characters. Joseph Smith, a lot of Smiths in that area, named Smith Mills, remember? And Barnabas Mosier, a lot of Mosiers too in that area, to take care towards building the meeting at Coaxit. And this was crossed out, and it didn't show. I crossed it out in the original slide. Newtown. It was left on. Coxet was crossed out in the original handwritten minute. It was crossed out. Yep. That was a temporary name used for that section of Smith Mills. In many of these minutes, they called that area Newtown, but then they stopped using that name later on. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if it was called Smith Mills before that or after that, but the Smiths were there and the Mills were there. So my guess is when Worth transcribed some other old records, he called it At the Mills. He didn't say Smith Mills, he said At the Mills. And that was in the 1600s, in some record. Yeah. Okay, so they're going to be in charge of getting the building going. And then in the following year, Paul Russell and Nathaniel Howland were given the job of taking care of building the house, and see what charges have arisen and bring what they find to report to the meeting. The meeting kept a pretty tight hand on what they were doing and what was going on, and that's a characteristic of the way they operated, and that's one of the reasons I believe that they were so successful for so many centuries in whaling and commerce and everything else. Okay, next slide, Don.
Where?
Yeah.
By the third dimension.
Yeah, I'm quite sure it's the third dimension,
Yeah.
with a ceiling height or something. Yep. Okay, next slide. And now we're getting down. They're explaining about what's costing and what's still owed. People made subscriptions. It's not any different than these days. So, oh yeah, I'll give. Didn't show up. So they said, you go get that money. That's what that says. This is due on the account for the meeting house, and Humphrey Smith, you go out and get that money, an order from the meeting. And then finally, in 1759, remember we started in 54. No, we started earlier than that. 45. This is now 59. This is a long time passed by. That was it. You passed the test. These two guys, the Hart owned all that land across from Merrithews, and Joseph Smith was in the Mosiers, and the Mosiers, the Smiths, and the Harts were all over Smith Mills anyway. So you're in charge of the burying ground. So when somebody's got to be buried, you make sure where they go and keep the records and so forth. Okay, next slide, Don. Okay, the name. I just got worn out trying to figure out how many variations there were. There are many more than this. And it's Marion.
There's some that had, instead of TH, they have CH. So Merrithews.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Merrithews.
Yes. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. All kinds of. Ho is often the ending. HOE.
It's spelled maybe 5 different ways.
Yeah. The scribes, the people who kept records, weren't all good spellers. I mean, probably wasn't even agreed how to spell it.
Right.
You know, some family members spelled it correctly, T-H-E-W, and others H-E-W.
And I might add, the first names were almost always correct.
Yeah.
Because they had the Bible to go to.
Yeah, that's right. They could.
Open up, how do you spell it? Open the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. Good point. One of the points Donald suggested, there's another name that phonetically sounds like Merrithews in Dartmouth records, old Plymouth Colony records primarily. It's Mayhew. And it does, in Mayhew on Martha's Vineyard and other places, is a fairly common name. And Mayhew with the H-I-E-W is not as common, but it was a definite name. But I haven't seen it used in this area very much. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now, one of the reasons the name is disappearing is that quite a few of the family sons left town. Some of them went with many of the other Quakers to New York State to live, and we've got the the removal records to show that, and others went locally. One son went to Fairhaven, and you'll see later that he's got a famous descendant in Fairhaven. And nevertheless, also the sons didn't produce as many sons in the later generations as they did in the earlier generations, but the women did. And I'm sure there are many descendants of the Merrithews still in Dartmouth, but their names are Kirby and Gifford and so on, because that's who the daughters married. But not many Merrithews left anymore. And I started, I know I got too much, I always get too much to talk about, but I started tracking the census records of Dartmouth and seeing how many Merrithews or variants were in the 1790 census record, in 1800, 1810, to show, I can make a graph and show when they petered out, but I just ran out of time to do that. Yeah, this is what I and I did it for a few years, a few decades, and that's what I found. And a lot of them up in New York State, some in Nova Scotia, some in Fairhaven, and so on. Okay, next slide. One of the connections that, if you search long enough, you'll find a lot of others, but I thought this one was worth mentioning. Henry Huddleston Rogers is considered quite a genius by many people. He made Rockefeller rich, so according to some record. He was rich himself, and he was generous to his hometown of Fairhaven, for sure.
This wasn't his hometown here in Dartmouth.
And his grandmother was a woman named Rhoda Huddleston. She'd married a Huddleston, and she was a Merrithew. And the line goes from Teague, first generation, to Josiah, the Smith Mills guy, who owned the land and had the meetings at his home. His son Joseph, his grandson Samuel, Samuel's daughter Rhoda, who married an Eldridge, and then no, wait a minute. Anyway, Mary Rogers, Mary Eldridge married a Rogers, and Henry Rogers was her son, Mary Rogers' son. So next slide, please.
I traced the Rogers name right back to the Mayflower. He's a descendant from the Mayflower.
Oh yeah, definitely. And he was also a good-looking dude. I mean, of course, he
He had a good barber.
this is about 1900. And this is Wiki. I borrowed that from Wiki. And of course, he went to Oil City. You all know where Oil City is in western Pennsylvania. It's where Drake discovered oil. It had a lot to do with getting the whale business going downhill. So this is like a transition man between whaling in New Bedford and the oil business that replaced whaling. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to take a break, have some goodies, and if we have any questions,